Okay, so I just made a new session. Saved it into our folder, our Music 2071 folder. So I want to show you there's two ways you can get audio into Pro Tools. You can either record it in, like we've done, in a couple examples, or you can import audio if you've already recorded it or you programmed a track or several tracks in some other program like GarageBand or Ableton, something like that. So Shift Apple I will bring up the import audio dialog. You can also go to File, Import Audio. So, but again, I just always have my hands kind of here, so for me it's easier to just use the quick keys. So I'm going to, I already exported some audio to use specifically for this, and so I'm going to highlight all these, and if you're not familiar with Macs, you can just, I'm sure PCs do this as well, I just haven't used a Windows computer in so many years, but you can either shift, click all of them, or you can just click and drag. And I'm just going to add these. So the difference between adding and copying is that it's not going to actually make new audio files saved with this new Pro Tools session. If you did want that, you would want to copy them, and it will make a physical new copy of all these audio files and store them with this new Pro Tools session. But I don't really need that, so I'm just going to add them. And if you're unsure what the difference is, you can ask me, or it's more about if you're going to take this somewhere else after the fact. So I'm going to save these. It's going to ask you where you want these. Do you want them on a new track, or do you want them in the clips list? So I'm just going to go with the clip list for now and just show you what that looks like. So this arrow in the bottom right corner will open your clips list. And so we can see all the audio we just imported, right? So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 tracks. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make Shift Apple N. I'm going to make 11 new tracks, new mono audio tracks. And I'm going to double click the first one and just start naming them. So I've got a kick, Apple arrow right brings up the next dialog. I've got snare top, snare bottom, overhead left, overhead right. What else do I got? I've got bass. Let's see, I've got a bass mic. I've got a bass solo. I've got piano low. Oops. Piano low. Piano high. And sax. And bone. All right. So now I'm going to drag all these in, and so these all already line up perfectly with themselves, and we can easily bring them into the start of this Pro Tools session if we go into shuffle mode. When we go into shuffle mode, and I drag this kick audio clip onto the click track, I don't know if you can see, but at the very beginning of that click track, there's a little yellow line, and you can see if I move it to another track, that line follows. So it's going to snap, in shuffle mode, it's going to snap the start of that audio file right to the beginning of the session right there. So I'm going to do that with all those. Kick, snare top, snare bottom. Now the difference is if I was in another mode, like slip mode, what do I have next? Overhead left. Here, it's going to let me slip it wherever I want it, right? So if I want it here, cool, but I don't. I want it at the very, very beginning of the session. So shuffle mode, we'll just snap it to the very beginning. Or it would snap it to the end of an audio file if you're dragging it to a track that's already got audio on it. So there's overhead left, overhead right. What's next? Bass mic, bass solo. And the reason I have this split is because in the session I was mixing, I wanted to process the solo a little differently. I wanted to EQ it differently. So I cut it from here actually, and I gave it its own track. So I'll go back later and cut this out, but let me just finish this for now. So piano low, piano high, sax, boom. All right, and I don't necessarily like to see the clips list once I'm done with it, so I just like to hide it like that. And so if we go to our mix window, you can see everything, all the faders are at 0, which is called unity, because we just made brand new tracks, so it defaults to this 0 unity state. All the pans are up the middle. The inputs are defaulted. We're not recording anything in this one, so we don't need these inputs assigned. And everything defaults to being outputted 1 and 2, which is our main left and right going out to our speakers, right? So that's how it defaults when you import audio onto new tracks. So let's see. The first thing we might want to do, well, if we listen to it, we'll probably hear that the levels are all over the place because the faders are not, there's no mix, right? There's no actual mix. All the faders are at unity. So it's not awful. Piano's a little loud. Can get a better mix on the drums. Bass is a little soft. But that's so that's import. How to get audio imported into Pro Tools. And we don't want to be in shuffle mode anymore, so I'll just change it back to slip. And let's see. If we were concerned at all about our inputs, we can set these to no input. And if you're doing something, if you want to do something to all the tracks, right, you don't even have to highlight them really. The option key will either do something to everything, or it'll do the opposite of a function. So for instance, if I want to set this track to no input, this track now has no input, and that's fine. If I want to set all of them to be no input, I can hold option, no input, and it changes all of them to no input. No, it was not necessary for this, just showing you. Now, one thing I like to do is, I'm gonna put EQs, I'm gonna put compressors on certain things as needed. But one thing I like to do is make an auxiliary track for things like the drums. And since I have the piano split onto 2 mono tracks, I'm gonna make an aux send for the piano, and then I'm gonna make a master aux send. I don't particularly like using a master track. We could do that. We could go stereo, master fader, and now everything that's set to go out 1 and 2 will go out this channel, and we could do some EQ or compression on the master fader. I just personally don't like to use a master track. I like to physically print a bounced 2-track into Pro Tools. So with a master track, you'd have to bounce it, and it'll do it in real time, and it'll bounce it to the hard drive somewhere. I like to physically have a printed 2-track in my Pro Tools session. So first thing I'm going to do, new track, Shift Apple N. I want to make 1 stereo aux input, and I want to make 1 stereo audio track. So if I go Apple right, see how it changes from mono to stereo? And Apple up and down will change what type of track we're making. So Apple down changes it to an aux input. We could go master fader, VCA, MIDI. So I'm going to make a stereo aux input. And over here, if you see this plus sign, that will allow us to make additional tracks other than this one we're talking about. So you can either click this plus or you can just go Apple plus, and it brings up another layer here. So I made my stereo aux input, and now I want to make a stereo audio track. And it's going to insert them right after the whatever track you had highlighted, it's going to insert them after that. If I had the overhead right selected and I made a new track, it's going to insert it right after that track. But I'm just going to delete that because I don't want it. So I'm going to call this print bus, and I'm going to call this one 2-track. So the print bus is just a generic term. I'm busing everything to this track, to this auxiliary track, and then I'm going to print it onto this 2-track. So it's just terminology. It's, you know, you could call it whatever you want. You could call it stereo bus. You could call this stereo print. This is just a terminology that I use. A lot of times I'll even just call this PB for print bus, and I'll just abbreviate this as 2-track. So if you've seen that in other videos, that's what that means. And now, so instead of everything going out 1 and 2, I want everything to go to this print bus, to this auxiliary track, and then from this auxiliary track to this stereo track. So I'm going to highlight all of these because I want to change all of these tracks' outputs. So told you before, option will do it to everything, but I don't want to do it to everything now, right? I don't want to do it to these 2 tracks that I just made. I want to do it to all the tracks that have audio on them. So we can hold Shift Option, and that'll change only what's selected. So I'm going to bus them to, and I already have a bus named PB for print bus. So now these all just got changed from outputting 1 and 2 to outputting to the print bus, which is this track. So I want to set the input of this track to PB. So everything here is going out a bus called the print bus, being bus 2, this track which has an input called print bus. So now I want to bus this, and I have one also called 2-track already. This is going out a bus called 2-track. This is accepting that bus called 2-track, and now this is outputting 1 and 2, and only this track is outputting 1 and 2. So if we want to hear that, we would need this track to be on input. And if we are ever going to solo something and take a listen as we're mixing, you might want to solo something to hear just what's happening in the piano, for instance, right? So we need to solo safe these tracks. Let me show you what I mean by that. So if I'm playing this and I solo the piano, I don't hear anything. That's because these tracks are not going out 1 and 2. They're not going straight to the speakers. They're going to this print bus. But I soloed these tracks. If I want to hear it, I also have to solo this one. And I'd also have to solo this one because this is the track that's actually going out to our speakers. Right? But that's kind of a pain. If all I want to do is solo the piano, I don't want to have to also solo these tracks. So we put them in a mode called Solo Safe, which you can do by holding Apple and clicking the solo button on these tracks. So now this track is on input because this is what is accepting all the input from these audio tracks, and it's sending them out to our speakers 1 and 2. Now if I solo the piano, because these tracks are in solo safe mode, I don't need to solo these when I solo something else. And so, for instance, let me show you why I make this 2-track. So when I'm done mixing a track, I'll put the 2-track in record, and I'll go to the top of the session, and I'm going to start recording. So now everything, all my audio is being bussed left and right to this print bus, this aux track, which is then busing to this stereo audio track. So now I have my entire mix inside my session, whereas if I had a master fader and I bounced it, it would just bounce it to the hard drive, you know, wherever I choose to save it. I like to have an actual print of the stereo track that I'm making in my Pro Tools session, because if I want to go back and fix something, like say in this section the piano was a little too loud, I can go back and I can lower the volume of the piano here, right? And I can just re-record this section. And now I can say I can consolidate this. So say I just made the fixes I wanted to make, and now I'm happy. So I highlight all of this and I go, let's see, where is it? I actually don't know where it is because I always use the quick key, but let's see, edit, consolidate clip, which is Shift Option 3. This symbol is Option, that's Shift number 3. So if you highlight everything and go Shift Option 3, it now made a new audio file. It consolidated these edits that I made into a new audio file, and now I can export my whole mix without having to bounce the whole thing all over. So if this was like a 6-minute tune, which, well, it's about 5, I wouldn't have to re-record all 5 minutes of it. I could just reprint the fixes I want to make, consolidate it into a single audio file, and export that. So that's why I prefer that's why I don't use a master fader, and I choose instead to use this series of a stereo bus aux track going to a stereo audio track. And I use the aux track because if I want to do any compression or EQ on the whole stereo mix, I do it to this track. It does all that processing and then sends it to my print track, my 2-track that I'm actually recording. Now it would technically do the same thing if I put the inserts on this track. I could eliminate this, but it's just it's really just a personal preference of mine. It gives me one extra step. If I just need to bring the volume of the entire mix down a few dB, I can do it here. I don't have to. If I've got automation on these faders, if I've got a great balance here, I don't necessarily want to touch these anymore. I can bring the whole thing down. I can bring the whole thing up from here, and it'll print it onto this audio track based on whatever I'm doing on this stereo bus. So I hope that made sense, and I'll go ahead and end it there because this is already a little longer than I expected.